Welcome back, everybody, to Lecture 3, History of U.S.-Russian Relations. I'm Peter Vronsky. Today, we're going to finally look at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, the second of the three summit conferences that shaped the coming Cold War and the world we live in today, at least in the context of Russian-American relations. In the past two lectures, we saw that relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were amicable during the Second World War, maybe a little less so with Britain, but overall, Stalin was mostly satisfied with the results of the Tehran Conference in November of 1943. Roosevelt and Stalin appeared to get along especially well after they met in person for the first time in Tehran. They both had agreed that European states should be decolonized after the war, beginning with France that had joined the Nazis. It was going to be stripped of its colonies in North Africa and Southeast Asia, Algeria, Vietnam, Cambodia. Churchill certainly objected, and considering Britain's colonial hold over India, it was not surprising he did. And Stalin and Roosevelt will sometimes joke, let's not tout Churchill. And together on occasion, Stalin and Roosevelt would outvote Churchill on certain issues. We saw that Churchill, despite some of his deep anti-communist sentiments, carves up with Stalin in the infamous percentage agreement the spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, surrendering to the Soviet Union Romania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Bulgaria, while ensuring that the British interest in Greece is not challenged by the Soviets. Stalin will adhere to this agreement, withdrawing support from communist factions in Greece who end up slaughtered in Greece by a British-backed conservative Greek faction returning to formal power after the Germans leave Greece. The Greek civil wars, there would be three of them between 1944 and 1949, will endure for some 5 years, and some 180,000 Greeks will perish in them. The only dark cloud in Allied relations so far is Stalin's bid to oust from power the official Polish Republic government in exile, the so-called London Pows, and replace them completely with a new provisional government he had sponsored, the so-called Lublin Poles, or the Polish Committee of National Liberation, the PCNL. And one has to remember that the Soviet Union had hostile relations with the Second Polish Republic since its founding, from 1918 straight through to its fall and exile to London in October of 1939 after the joint Soviet-German invasion of Poland. The Soviets understandably did not want to see this government return to Warsaw, obviously. In August 1944, as the Red Army approached Warsaw, the London Poles ordered a revolt by the AK, Armia Krajowa, the National Army, their underground army in German-occupied Poland. They ordered it to seize control of the city before the arrival of the Red Army. The revolt ended up brutally crushed by the Nazis, while Soviet troops appeared to deliberately halt outside the city, allowing the Nazis to destroy the London Pows power base in Warsaw. This causes some temporary friction between the British and the Americans and the Soviets, but it's quickly forgotten. Historians today mostly conclude that the Soviets had halted their offensive outside of Warsaw for military logistical reasons, and that it had nothing to do with ensuring that the Nazis destroy the AK. But intended or not, that was the result. The AK, although not entirely destroyed, was now living under the provisional governance of the Lublin Poles, backed by the Red Army's presence in Poland. In the meantime, France, which the US and Soviet Union had planned on punishing for collaborating with the Nazis, through the offices of Charles de Gaulle's Free French government in exile, also in London, fought for recognition as the legitimate anti-Nazi representative of France from the very beginning of the war, or at least the war for the French. De Gaulle traveled to Moscow to get Stalin to recognize his government as the legitimate French government, and de Gaulle will get this in exchange for the French recognition of Stalin's sponsored Lublin Pows as the legitimate provisional government of Poland instead of the London Pows. At Tehran, the Russians pressed their claim over Polish regions that were part of the old Russian Empire. Here you can see Poland before its partition in the late 1770s. Gradually, Russia, Prussia, and Austria will destroy Poland between 1772 and 1795 as a sovereign state. They will end up dividing it up between themselves, with eventually Warsaw, Lublin, Vilna, all these major Polish cities being part of the Russian Empire, with the border of Russia now up against Austria's and Prussia's, and of course, once Prussia unifies the rest of the German states, will become Germany itself. In fact, this is the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian border on the eve of World War I. And as we saw, the Russians will lose this vast territory in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. That's the price that Lenin will pay for Russia's exit from the war. Germany will seize everything here along the Brest-Litovsk line, and Germany will not be able to hang on to it. Within 7 months or so, Germany, Austro-Hungary will be defeated, but of course the rogue Bolshevik Russians will not be returned the imperial territory that Lenin had given up. Instead, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia will be carved out of that Russian imperial territory to become sovereign nations on their own. In 1939, in partnership with Nazi Germany, the Russians will now seize their portion of Poland while the Germans seize theirs, and Poland once again will cease to officially exist. And a year later, the Russians will as well seize Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, restoring much of the imperial territory that Lenin had surrendered to the West. Now, at Yalta, and already the process began at Tehran, the Russians want to make this a permanent condition. And so the Allies agree now to establish new borders for Poland by kind of picking up Poland, essentially, and moving it westward, handing over parts of Germany here on the left and former East Prussia over to Poland on its western border, like that. While on the eastern border, the Poles would lose parts of Poland retaken by the Soviet Union in 1939, along a line that had been established back in 1919 by Lord Curzon, in his opinion, as to where the divisions between Poland and Russia might lie. And so the Curzon line is restored and now becomes the line on which the Russians will make their claim to that western portion of Poland, or at least western portion of Russia that was part of Poland. I guess the eastern portion of Poland, not to confuse things. And the Allies agree to this. The London Pows readily agree to Poland's annexation of German territory on Poland's western border, but vehemently object to the transfer of Polish territory to the Soviet Union on the eastern border. Essentially, the Poles now wanted to keep both the old part of what was Imperial Russia's part of Poland, and now a new part of Poland that would have been seized from the Germans. Essentially, the Poles wanted to have their cake and eat it too. And that is where things essentially stand as the Allies are getting ready to gather at Yalta for their second summer summit conference in February, from February 4th to February 11th, 1945. Yalta in Crimea is chosen because Stalin was firstly paranoid about flying. Secondly, he wanted to remain inside the Soviet Union, and he could guarantee both Roosevelt's and Churchill's safety at the conference in Crimea. When the Allies had met in Tehran the previous year, the Germans had contemplating assassinating all three of them in Iran. Yalta, of course, on the Black Sea in Soviet territory, was considered to be much more secure. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the opening of Soviet archives to historians in 1990, Soviet policy papers prepared at that time on the eve of the Yalta Conference reveal that the Soviets had a very optimistic outlook on the future, in which they could see that the wartime grand alliance of Britain, US, and the USSR would continue into peace and into economic trade in the post-war period, a kind of division of the world between the three powers. Soviet policy forecasts were predicated on the U.S. participation in future European affairs. The Soviets are actually counting on the U.S. to administrate a newly disarmed Germany and to extract reparations from Germany in goods and services to repair the significant war damage inflicted on the USSR. The Soviet policy papers on the eve of Yalta had anticipated that the prior U.S. isolationist policy of the past will not be revived, and the Soviets counted on the U.S. military presence in Europe to keep Germany in check in the future in a partnership with the Soviet Union. Ironically, when the war is over and the United States begins sending troops home from Germany, the Soviets will actually be unhappy with these early troop withdrawals, something that we can hardly imagine once the Cold War begins. The fact that the Allies had identified a primary role for the USSR in the post-war United Nations, with a permanent seat with veto power, further raised Stalin's optimism for a new world peace that will be jointly administered by the British, US, and Soviets in Europe, and with the Republic of China in Asia. France's entry into this power circle will be grudgingly acquiesced to by Stalin, as per the deal they made over France's recognition of the Lublin Pows as the legitimate provisional government of Poland. At Yalta, it is agreed that the immediate priority was the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and its allies. To a great extent, the Allies did not want to alienate the Soviet war effort. It was still too early. It was essential to the final defeat of not only Nazi Germany, but the final defeat of Japan as well in the Pacific. The main objective of Russian post-war policy in Europe will be to render Germany incapable of making war for at least the next 50 years. And this Stalin believed can be done in only one of two possible ways. One, by a unified Germany that is completely and unambiguously friendly to the Soviet Union, or at worst, neutral, an unlikely scenario. The second option was the dismemberment and complete partitioning of Germany into multiple states, its transformation to a rural economy, and long-term joint occupation by Soviet, US, British, and later French troops. Both Britain and the USA, by Tehran, certainly had indicated that they were in for this game plan. The only thing uncertain was into how many states they will partition defeated Germany into. Churchill was recommending something between 5 and 7 states. Churchill felt that the villains in the case of both wars, the First World War and the Second World War, were the Prussians, not necessarily, Germany. The USSR and the USA, they felt that Germany should be partitioned to its perhaps 19th century 107 principalities and grouped into deindustrialized zones as per the Morgenthau Plan, devised by Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, who foresaw a complete reduction of Germany to a disarmed, captive agrarian estate after the war. Instead, at Yalta, it's decided that Germany will be divided into 4 occupation zones, with the French now admitted into the occupying powers sharing Germany. The Soviet Union agreed to France becoming a 4th occupying power in Germany and in Berlin, as well as having a veto power vote on the UN Security Council, as long as France's territory in Germany is carved out from the British and the US's 2/3 of the territories. The USSR will insist on keeping its third undiluted. Germany would now be jointly governed by the Americans, Russians, British, and French through the Allied Control Council, the ACC, or the Allied Control Authority. Germany will remain formally under Allied occupation until March 15th, 1991, when the formal occupation will end some 6 months after Germany's reunification in October of 1990. Berlin itself, deep inside the Soviet zone of Germany, will be divided likewise into 4 zones. This is going to present, for the good next 5 decades, all sorts of complications. And firstly, access to Berlin, which again has French, British, and American territories in it, has to be made available through the Russian zone. And so for secure transit corridors will be established through the Soviet zone, connecting West Berlin with the American and British zones, and what will eventually and prematurely become West Germany. These 4 corridors, which include as well waterways, canals, railway connections, and as well air corridors, are strictly regulated. There's no wandering off these corridors. For vehicular traffic, there will be checkpoints. Checkpoint Alpha will be on the West German side. Checkpoint Bravo will be at the end of the corridor on the Berlin side. And of course, Checkpoint Charlie will be on the actual division between West Berlin and East Berlin, on the interior in the middle of Berlin, where the wall will go up. Anybody traveling on these roads will have to go through a complicated check-in process and check-out process. This is kind of what it looks like at the beginning point on the West German border. You can see Alpha checkpoint is where you start off at, presenting your passport and your permit to travel through that corridor. You pass by the West German barrier, and then you're met by someone from the Allied occupation. A Soviet soldier will check your papers. You will then approach the East German border through a Soviet checkpoint. Once the Soviets check you through, you then proceed to the East German customs police barrier. By now, you've been issued a pass. And once you get through East German customs and the police barrier, you then approach the East German police barrier where you will surrender your temporary pass. And depending upon which corridor you're using, you have a fixed amount of time to get from checkpoint Alpha to checkpoint Bravo. They will check your mileage. They'll check the time that you checked into Alpha and the time that you arrive at Bravo. At the longest stretch, I think you were given approximately 4.5 hours to make it from Alpha to Bravo. And woe to you if you have car trouble on the way. You were strictly required to remain and wait for help to arrive. There was no driving off this highway that went through East German territory. Here you can see if you veered off from the direction of Berlin and ended up driving towards Leipzig, which was East Germany, you wouldn't get very far on that road. Here's the Allied checkpoint Bravo on the West Berlin border with East Germany in the last years of the Allied occupation, 1991. Berlin itself is going to be likewise divided, although the wall is not going to go up until much later. From 1945 to 1961, inside of Berlin, people could move and circulate freely between the four zones. It was just a matter of leaving the Russian sector or leaving the American sector and going into the Russian sector or into the French sector and so forth. I can't really tell you about issues of residency, whether you could get change your residence, could get a permit to live from one sector to another, but certainly there was free movement throughout Berlin in this period between these sectors. There was no wall. It's in 1961 that the East Germans and the Soviet Union will encircle West Berlin with a permanent barricade and then erect over the years this massive concrete wall cutting off West Berlin from East Berlin and East Germany, marooning West Berlin essentially in an island of Soviet territory, except for those 3 transit corridors. Divided Berlin will become the ground zero of the Cold War to come, and will remain so until the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. At Yalta, the Russians make it very clear that in the future, they will insist on a border security cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone between Western Europe and Russia in a type of never again national defense policy. The Russians pointed out that the attacks into Russia were launched from German-occupied Poland, which the British and French failed to defend against German aggression in September 1939, conveniently skipping over the part where the Soviets had aligned themselves with the Nazis in that invasion and helped themselves to half of Poland. But nonetheless, this is what the Soviets will want, as Churchill golds Stalin on the issue of the Curzon line. Anytime Stalin would bring up the Curzon line as what he had hoped the eastern border of Poland will be, Churchill will kind of jab at Stalin and say, Curzon line, you mean the Ribbentrop-Molotov line, the one that you drew up with Hitler. And Stalin would respond, I don't care what you call it, but that's what we want. Furthermore, Stalin here reminds everybody that Finland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, along with Italy and the puppet states of Croatia and Slovakia, had participated in the joint invasion of the USSR and the perpetration of atrocities on its territories. These were not just occupied staging areas in the way Poland had been, but willing Nazi allies with whom the Soviet Union was currently engaged in bloody combat on the Eastern Front on a much more intense scale and scope than in Western Europe. And it was taking millions of Soviet casualties as a result. Stalin's position after the war was simple. All the former enemy states on Russia's border must forever be rendered either as neutral at best or either neutral at worst or at best friendly to the Soviet Union, including divided Germany. At its most charitable, the orthodox view of how the Cold War starts is that this Soviet need, paranoia, for maintaining a buffer zone of friendly countries along its border precipitates a policy of Soviet Iron Curtain expansionism and brutally repressive totalitarian communist takeovers backed by the Soviet military and secret police, a process that Orthodox Cold War historians describe as the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, to which the Western democracies find themselves with no option other than to contain and resist this Sovietization. It explains the Cold War as a natural democratic response to Soviet totalitarian aggression, seeking to suppress the democratic process in Eastern Europe. The real story is a little more complex and typically somewhere between the future Western view and the Soviet view. As Andrei Gide is often quoted, quote, "The color of truth is gray," end of quote. Firstly, it has to be underscored that the governments of pre-war Poland, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria were either dictatorial monarchies or military dictatorships. They were not democratic states by any stretch of the imagination. The only state in Eastern Europe that could be described as democratic was the former Czechoslovakia. Secondly, a significant portion of resistance movements in Nazi-occupied and Nazi-allied Europe between 1941 and 1944 were communist or allied with communist factions. Communists in fascist Italy had been repressed by Mussolini since the 1920s, and in Nazi Germany since 1933. Unlike other resistance groups, the communists had developed deep, extensive, and sophisticated underground networks. Moscow as well, since 1919, had sponsored a global network of revolutionary operatives, the Comintern, the Communist International, which in 1943, as a sop to the British and Americans, Stalin renamed the Cominform, the Communist Information Agency. It was, at its core, a clandestine instrument of Moscow foreign policy objectives. And once the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, of course, it becomes key in the resistance. From the beginning of the war in September 1939, when the Soviet Union and Germany jointly attacked and partitioned Poland, until the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans in June 1941, the communist underground in occupied Europe remained functioning, but engaged in no open resistance. After the Nazi invasion of the USSR, however, communist resistance suddenly blossomed everywhere, from France to Italy, Greece, and Yugoslavia, and it would dominate resistance movements in some regions until the Americans and British deployed in Italy in 1943 and Normandy in 1944, and began buttressing other non-communist resistance movements. In most people's minds, however, the communists are most often associated with resistance against the Nazis and fascist aggression. In fact, in Italy to this day, the partigiani, the partisans, is synonymous with communist, as is Italy's still today very active National Association of Italian Partisans, ANPI, the Associazione Nazionale Partigiani d'Italia. There are even distinct anti-communist party associations in Italy, like the APC, the Association of Christian Partisans, to make the distinction from left-wing partisans or Jewish resistance groups in wartime Italy. So the result of this kind of deeply seated communist resistance cell will be a very strong and indigenous communist party system in virtually every country of Western and Eastern Europe by the end of the war. While, with the exception of post-war Greece, these communist movements were unquestionably aided and supported by the Soviet Union. But it would be a mistake to characterize them as Soviet, quote, puppets or Soviet front organizations foisted by force on the various countries. These were, as I say, indigenous, organic communist movements, and their numbers were spectacular. Italy, 1.8 million card-carrying Communist Party members. Czechoslovakia, nearly 1.3 million. France, 1 million. Germany, 800,000. Hungary, 600,000. Bulgaria, We can see the number here, 427,000. These were, as I say, card-carrying party members. You have to include as well their families, supporters, people that didn't exactly um, enlist in the party membership, who were all very supportive. While this theoretically should have been less a problem for the Americans and the British in Eastern Europe, it was particularly troubling in Italy and France, as elections there seem to promise that there will be either communist-led governments formed as a result of the election, or at least the communists would have a significant role in the new post-war governments going up there. And so the U.S. will start in late 45 and 1946 secretly backing the founding of communist opposition parties in both France and Italy, fund them clandestinely through the State Department and through the U.S. intelligence agency, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. In Italy, the United States essentially funds the founding of the powerful right-wing conservative Christian Democratic Party, which presented itself as both anti-fascist and anti-communist. The same thing was done in the post-war elections in France, where US-funded political propaganda portrayed the left-wing Popular Front coalition as an instrument of Judeo-Bolshevism, appealing to lingering French anti-Semitism that had fueled their previous Vichy collaboration with Nazi Germany. However, when we review declassified Soviet policy papers from that period as they were released and made public to historians in the 1990s in the wake of the collapse of the Communist Party in Russia, we see that this very central to Stalin's and the Soviet Union's post-war strategy was a belief that newly restored former enemy governments would become what Stalin termed, quote, progressive democracies, end of quote. Socialist governments moving leftwards democratically toward communism without the need for revolution nor the need for a dictatorship of the proletariat. What we could describe today as organic communism, borrowing a social media term. In other words, that this was something that wasn't necessarily bought through, followers, but developed organically from the people themselves. Not only did Stalin believe that this was to unfold in Eastern Europe, but he believed that this would be a wave that would gradually sweep Western Europe and the rest of the world. And Stalin has good reason to be optimistic in his belief. As we begin to see post-war elections in Europe, it further bolstered Stalin's belief that communism will develop organically in the East. November 1945, in Bulgaria, the communists gain 88% of the vote. Hungary, communists get 17% in November 1945, 22% in August of 1947, and will lead a bloc of left-wing parties taking 66% of the seats in parliament. In other words, that coalition forms the government. Poland, 1947, the January 1947, the communist-led bloc takes 80% of the vote. Romania, November 1946, the communist bloc gets 80% of the vote. Yugoslavia, November 1945, 90% of the vote. Now, I don't want to suggest that all these were completely free elections. The elections in Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania were characterized by copious ballot box rigging, violence, and intimidation. But this was not necessarily a communist tactic to rig the electoral process. These countries had no democratic electoral traditions in the past. This kind of electoral misconduct was essentially more of business as usual from the pre-war period rather than a concerted Soviet conspiracy to subvert the electoral process. Stalin was a cold pragmatist and a sincere Marxist-Leninist who believed that he was next in line to adapt the original precepts of Marxism to the next historical necessities of the time. Stalin can be described as a Marxist-Stalinist, the founder of a new sect of Marxism emerging from the catastrophe of the Second World War. Stalin believed that the Second World War, fascism, and the Nazi occupation had performed the same function as revolution in every European country by destroying the power elites and large property owners along with the middle classes, making a proletariat dictatorship, which had been so necessary following the Russian Revolution to break the hold of the ruling elite there, completely unnecessary in post-war Europe after the Nazis. Stalin, for example, will tell the Polish communists in May of 1946, in Poland, there is no dictatorship of the proletariat, and you don't need it there. The democracy that you have established in Poland, in Yugoslavia, and partly in Czechoslovakia is a democracy that is drawing you closer to socialism without the necessity of establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat or the Soviet system. Lenin never said there was no path to socialism other than the dictatorship of the proletariat. He admitted that it was possible to arrive at the path to socialism utilizing the foundations of the bourgeois democratic system, such as parliament. And Stalin, to a certain point, has learned this from the experience of Adolf Hitler, who used what was described as the most democratic constitution in Europe at its time, the Weimar Constitution in Germany, to establish his dictatorship. And so from 1944 to 1946, Stalin repeats this lecture to almost every Communist Party leadership in Eastern Europe, to the Bulgarians, the Czechs, the Poles, Hungarians, Romanians, the Yugoslavs. It is actually beginning to irritate many of the local communist leaders who before the war had lived under right-wing dictatorial regimes, sometimes underground in their countries, and were now anxious and impatient to consolidate their own political goals and role in the future governance after the war and in the wake of the end of fascism. Stalin annoyingly kept reining in their totalitarian tendencies in a sincere belief that socialism would naturally develop in Europe on its own accord through a democratic electoral process in the post-war period. We get a sense of Stalin's thinking on the eve of Yalta from the remarks he makes to Tito and the Yugoslav Communist Party Politburo. Stalin tells him that the capitalist world is divided into two rival camps, democratic and fascist. Germany, he says, after its defeat, will remain potentially a dangerous force unless the Allies partition it and weaken it industrially. But the threat, Stalin says, can come from somewhere else. Stalin will say, the crisis of capitalism today is caused mainly by the decay and mutual ruin of the two enemy camps, the fascists and the Democrats. This is favorable for victory of socialism in Europe. But we have to forget the idea that the victory of socialism could be realized only through Soviet rule. It could be presented by some other political systems, for example, by a democracy, a parliamentary republic, and even by a constitutional monarchy. Today, socialism is possible even under the English monarchy. Revolution is no longer necessary everywhere. Yes, socialism is possible even under an English king. And certainly what will militate Soviet totalitarian malfeasance is where Stalin is presented in these countries in his sphere, attempts by political factions in them to involve the Americans or British in the electoral processes, as was occurring in France and Italy outside Stalin's sphere. Stalin will see that as unacceptable interference in territories that he feels are in the Soviet sphere of influence. If we don't want to believe Stalin's words, we can look at the one country directly bordering on the Soviet Union that escaped the fate of becoming a captive Iron Curtain Warsaw Pact Soviet-style country, whose political parties from the beginning refused to appeal to American or British influence and chose to instead to deal with the Soviet Union and its own Communist Party by utilizing its own political resources and maintaining a scrupulously neutral foreign policy to this day. And of course, I'm referring to Finland. Despite the fact that the Finns had gone to war with Russia, or let's be more clear, the Russians had first gone to war with Finland, and then the Finns allied with Germany, and when Germany invaded Russia, went to war against Russia. Nonetheless, Finland remained, despite the fact that, as I say, it had invaded Russia, after the war, Finland remained completely outside the grip of the Iron Curtain and remains a neutral country to this day, scrupulously neutral towards the Soviet Union and towards Russia today. Soviet Union never felt the need to force Finland behind its so-called Iron Curtain. It was secure in Finland's neutrality. Thus, when the Big Three met at Yalta in February 1945, just a few months before the final defeat of Nazi Germany, there was nothing intrinsically expansionist or confrontational in Stalin's strategy. Nothing hinted at the coming Cold War. Although Stalin was unsure of how long Britain and the USA would be committed to Soviet security, he was not anticipating them as a threat to it. He saw the threat coming primarily from a revived Germany and was counting on Britain and the United States to jointly contain with the Soviets that German threat. One item on Stalin's national security agenda was still left vague and undetermined at Yalta, and that was the Soviet Union's warm water access to the Mediterranean through the Turkish Straits. Stalin had been lobbying for a revision of the Montreux Convention on the Straits, which gave Turkey power to regulate naval traffic through the Straits. He was vaguely assured by the Americans and the British that, quote, the Soviet Union should have access to warm water, end of quote. But no further commitments that this was forthcoming, and the issue again of the Turkish Straits was tabled for further discussions. The Allies kind of slipped around it. Next was the issue of reparations to be extracted by the Allies from the four zones of defeated Germany. Stalin surprised his delegation at Yalta by suddenly demanding that they calculate the amount of reparations the USSR was going to be seeking from Germany. They initially had toyed with a figure of $5 billion. Now, suddenly, after a quick round of whispered discussions, the Soviets come back with 10 billion as the number of in Germany's wartime debt to the Soviet Union. And so at Yalta, Germany's wartime debt is therefore fixed at 22 billion with a B, with the USSR allocated 50% for, quote, basis of discussions, end of quote, to ascertain the final amounts later. The World War I reparation amount imposed on Germany in 1919 had been equivalent to $33 billion. And Germany, of course, had been unable to pay it. Many blamed the rise of Nazism and the Second World War on the heavy punishing debt imposed on Germany, which Germany, by the way, will not settle entirely its Versailles Treaty obligations until 2010. So it's obvious to impose that kind of massive cash penalty on Germany would be futile. And so at Yalta, it's agreed that reparations in kind would be exacted from defeated Germany in three following forms according to the Yalta Protocols. A, removals within 2 years from the surrender of Germany or the cessation of organized resistance from the national wealth of Germany. located on the territory of Germany herself as well as outside her territory. Equipment, machine tools, ships, rolling stock, German investments abroad, shares of industrial transport and other enterprises in Germany, including intellectual properties in the form of patents, pharmaceuticals, petrochemical formulas. These removals will be carried out chiefly for the purpose of destroying the war potential of Germany and reconstructing Soviet industry and infrastructure destroyed by the Nazis during their invasion of the Soviet Union. B. Annual deliveries to the Soviet Union of 10% of all goods from current production in all of occupied Germany, plus an additional mandatory 15% in exchange for natural resources delivered to allies in the Western German zones from the Soviet Eastern German zone for a period to be later determined. In other words, the product of 25% of all manufacturing revived in the American, British, and French zones would be allocated to the Soviet Union. One just from that can easily foresee the problems coming when American post-war investments begin to pour into revived German companies in the Western zone of occupied Germany if 25% of their output would be consigned to the USSR as a form of reparation payments by the Germans. One does not have to be a fortune teller to see which way this is going to go. And finally, C, the use of German forced labor. Approximately 2.3 million German prisoners of war will be kept or sent from Germany into the Soviet Union to work on rebuilding of the country, along with several 100,000 ethnic Germans from some of the Eastern European countries. Their death rate in Soviet captivity will range between 20 and 40%, depending upon the type of work and region that were required to fulfill this term. And German prisoners of war, POWs, would not begin returning home until 1953, upon Stalin's death. The last German POWs were released in 1956, 11 years after the war. As well, in a secret annex to the Yalta Protocols, the Allies agree to repatriate all Soviet citizens found in Europe back to the Soviet Union, whether they wanted to return home or not. This partly has to do with German military policy. Germany had raised a massive Nazi foreign legion under the auspices of the notorious Waffen-SS. In virtually every country that the Germans had occupied or allied with, and even some it had not, like Spain, for example, the Nazis appealed to the local population to volunteer against the war against Bolshevism. Here you can see, for example, the Dutch poster calling for Dutch volunteers in the Waffen-SS fight Bolshevism. Here's one for the Norwegian SS, the Hungarian SS. Here's the Croatian and Bosnian SS recruiting poster. Again, the fight against Bolshevism. Very often, these foreign troops, before being deployed to Russia, would be deployed against fight with bandits, in quotation marks, at home, or in assisting in the killing of the Jews during the final solution, the Holocaust. Here you can see a division of Tajik volunteers from Central Asia, Russia. The Japanese sent a unit of Koreans to fight in the German army as volunteers. Hitler promised India that once he defeats Britain, he will liberate India, and there were a lot of Indian volunteers in the German army, the Hindi Tigers, for example. Some fought in Normandy under Rommel's command on the Eastern Wall. In fact, Indian troops were amongst the last to defend Berlin. When the Russians would take out a bunker in Berlin, they were shocked to find these turbaned Indian troops there. And, we'd have to look at their maps. Are we in Berlin or Bombay? Did we, take a wrong turn somewhere? Even British soldiers, POWs, were recruited into the St. George's Brigade of the Waffen-SS, the British Free Corps. And in fact, 3 Canadians who were captured along with British soldiers at Dieppe ended up joining this SS division of British Canadian soldiers who fought for Hitler. We don't know very much about them. It's the information about them are scant, and we just have these few shadowy photographs of them. They kind of vanished after the end of the war. But you can see there they are with Union Jacks on their sleeves. In Russia, of course, the Nazis raised massive units of volunteers. The Russians, Ukrainians, White Russians, other ethnicities, many of them hated Stalin. Many of them could not imagine anything worse than Stalin, and ended up volunteering for various reasons to serve in these German Cossack units, as I had described the path of my grandfather and my father, who became a child soldier in one of these Cossack units. Eventually, these units ended up deployed in France, in the case of my family, in Italy as well. And of course, per provisions of the Yalta Agreement, they were to be handed over back upon their surrender to Russian authorities for repatriation back to the Soviet Union, whether they wanted it or not. In fact, the British kind of assembly and consignment rendition of the Cossacks to the Red Army was labeled as Operation Keyhole. And the British quite brutally forced these people back across into Soviet custody, where many of them would be summarily executed once they were taken prisoner by the Soviets. And again, I kind of leave it as an unsolved mystery, at least to this point, until I can get into British archives, how exactly it was that our family ended up being exfiltrated through the Polish corps in Italy rather than being consigned to Operation Keyhole. Otherwise, I don't think I would be here lecturing you. At least if I was lecturing, I would have not been lecturing in English. And these secret provisions, once they're revealed very quickly after the end of the war, are going to be denounced, because not only do they apply to these collaborator units who had joined the Nazi war effort, but as well to slave laborers who were found in German concentration camps and various factories by the liberating Russians. They too are consigned to return back to the Soviet Union, and they're regarded as contaminated, as are Russian POWs. Very often, kind of in the Russian war mentality, if you're a prisoner of war, it means you didn't fight enough. You didn't fight to the death. It was expected you would fight to the death. And so often becoming a POW was tantamount to treason. And so Russian POWs released from horrific conditions in Nazi concentration camps often were directly sent into the Gulag, where some of them served up to another 8 years, 10 years in the Gulag. So all these provisions will be later denounced by Cold War proponents, who will portray Yalta as a betrayal of Eastern Europe and its people, and as well, it will become an election issue when, of course, the end of the Truman administration, the Republicans, Truman was a Democrat, as was Roosevelt, the Republicans will accuse the Democrats of being soft on communism in that election. It will lead to the first time a Republican is elected since the 1920s, the election of Dwight Eisenhower as the Republican president in 1952. So Yalta will be an issue internally, and that will be something, another aspect of U.S. Russian relations, of course, is what is happening in U.S. Politics right to this day. It often impacts and kind of colors the kind of foreign policy, or perhaps the foreign policy, in fact, colors electoral policy. It's a kind of a circular relationship. At Yalta, Stalin promises to enter the fight against the Empire of Japan within 90 days of the defeat of Germany. And he will remain true to that promise. In return, the Soviet Union will receive the southern part of Sakhalin Island, which it had lost to Japan. The Japanese, of course, will be thrown out of Korea, which they had essentially made part of Japan, a province of Japan, back, I think, around shortly after the 1905 war, will become a sovereign state, or at least a mandated sovereign state. And the Kuril Islands as well will now be taken from Japan and given to the Soviet Union. This radically transforms and extends the Soviet presence in the Pacific from the interior, the way it was here, where the Japanese controlled essentially access to the Sea of Okhotsk, to the reverse, where now the Russians drive forward their extension beyond the Sea of Okhotsk directly into the Pacific Ocean. And Korea, as I say, will be taken away from Japan, and it will be occupied by the Soviets in the north and the Americans in the south, pending a planned national election from which a sovereign, unified Korea was supposed to emerge by the late 1940s. We will see how nothing of the sort will occur there. And the current problem with Korea is essentially rooted in the situation that will develop there in the Cold War after 1945. At Yalta, the Soviet Union agreed on the charter and structure of the United Nations, which would replace the decrepit League of Nations, and promised to attend in April 1945 the San Francisco Conference to sign the new United Nations Charter. The primary wartime allies would have a permanent seat on the Security Council with the power to veto any Security Council resolution for taking action, with France now included as the fifth member. Prior to this, the League of Nations, before the League of Nations could do anything, there had to be a unanimous vote. Now, with the United Nations, and of course, when that was the case for the League of Nations ended up doing nothing. In particular, in two notorious cases, that was the invasion by Italy of Abyssinia, and of Ethiopia, as it's known today, and of course the invasion by Japan of Manchuria, of China. In both cases, there always was somebody who would not add to the unanimous vote to take action to sanction Italy or sanction Japan. And so the United Nations now provides for this, giving major powers power to veto any action that the Security Council may order to take. The General Assembly really has no real power to do anything other than kind of set up policy resolutions upon which the Security Council may take an active decision on. But these five countries, to this day, ridiculously, France, have veto power. Of course, Russia, USA, even the United Kingdom and China certainly are the kind of world powers that should have the veto. France, why not Germany, or why not Italy now, or why not a number of other countries, South Korea, Taiwan, that have become kind of also global industrial powers. Certainly not France compared to Germany today. But that's essentially, once again, what we're living with as a result of the Yalta Conference to this day in 2021. The final status of Poland was discussed. Despite the London Pows opposition, Poland's eastern border with the Soviet Union was now explicitly stipulated by the Yalta Protocols as being at the former Curzon line, with minor deviations to account for ethnic groups residing along the line. The Yalta Protocols read, quote, "The three heads of government consider that the eastern frontier of Poland should follow the Curzon line with digressions from it in some regions of 5 to 8 kilometers in favor of Poland." The London Pows refuse to endorse this provision. The decision where to lay the border on the west with Germany will be tabled to a committee to resolve in the future, and will eventually be fixed at the Oder-Niese River line. The problem was there were two branches of the Niese River, and so it took them a couple of months to decide on exactly which branch of the Niese River they're going to lay the border. But here you can see the main branch, the one that's to the west, is going to be the one that will become the new border between Germany and Poland, and remains the border to this day. The problem remaining was the provisional government of Soviet-sponsored Lublin Pows. This problem was complicated by the fact that Poland at this time was under the complete control of the Red Army. At Yalta, it's agreed to reorganize the provisional Polish government that had been set up by the Red Army with the inclusion of other groups, and to have democratic elections. The exact provision for this stated: the provisional government, which is now functioning in Poland, should therefore be reorganized on a broader democratic basis with the inclusion of democratic leaders from Poland itself and from Poles abroad. This new government should then be called the Polish Provisional Government of National Unity. This Polish Provisional Government of National Unity shall be pledged to the holding of free and unfettered elections as soon as possible on the basis of universal suffrage and secret ballot. In these elections, all democratic and anti-Nazi parties shall have the right to take part and to put forward candidates. Only after these elections, according to the Yalta Protocols, would Britain and the USA consider reorganizing the new Polish government. We have problems here. The British and Americans would differ from the Soviets how this provision is to be interpreted. The British and Americans thought that the provisional government of so-called Lublin Poles was to be scrapped completely and replaced by a new government that would level the playing field for all, Soviet-sponsored parties as well as other parties, including the London Pows. The Soviets, however, interpret the provision that says, the government is to be reorganized on a broader democratic basis with the inclusion. The Soviets interpreted that provision as requiring them to enlarge and expand the current provisional government to include other Polish factions, but only those which recognize the Curzon line. That essentially locked the London-based government in exile, which continued to insist on its sovereignty over the old Polish territories beyond the Curzon line, locked them out. Again, France and the Soviet Union were allied with Czechoslovakia in 1938, while Poland not only obstructed possible assistance to Czechoslovakia in favor of Germany, but as well conspired with the Nazis to take a small piece of Czechoslovakia for themselves. By virtue of this, the Soviet Union refused to recognize the former Polish government in exile as, quote, an anti-Nazi party. As it says in these provisions, all democratic and anti-Nazi parties shall have the right to take part. And so the Soviets argue that the London Pows positioned later as being anti-Nazis is only by virtue of Germans invading them rather than by choice. Nonetheless, Yalta explicitly confirmed, notwithstanding the refusal of the London Post to recognize it, the Polish eastern border would now follow the Curzon line, and Poland would receive substantial territorial compensation in the west from Germany, although the exact border with Germany was to be determined at a later time. Shortly, this would begin to be the cause of friction. At first, primarily with Churchill, who had sponsored the London Pows, but eventually with the United States as well. Here will lie the early roots to the Cold War, the first kind of manifestation of the Cold War. Finally, in the last item in the public protocols of Yalta, the three powers signed a Declaration of Liberated Europe, the provisions of which included one in which the three powers, quote, declare their mutual agreement to concert during the temporary period of instability in liberated Europe, the policies of their three governments in assisting the peoples liberated from the domination of Nazi Germany and the peoples of the former Axis satellite states of Europe to solve by democratic means their pressing political and economic problems. The establishment of order in Europe and the rebuilding of national economic life must be achieved by processes which will enable the liberated people to destroy the last vestiges of Nazism and fascism and to create democratic institutions of their own choice. This is a principle of the Atlantic Charter, the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live, the restoration of sovereign rights and self-government to those peoples who have been forcibly deprived to them by the aggressor nations. End of quote. Again, the orthodox historiography of the Cold War portrays to us the Soviets as having put their signature to the Declaration of Liberated Europe insincerely, while committed to installing repressive regimes in the Eastern European countries liberated them, a process these historians will label as Sovietization. Yet, we see document after document coming out of the Soviet archives after the fall of communism in the 1990s that point to a very different and more rosy, optimistic point of view by Stalin, bordering on sweet naivete. I've already earlier quoted Stalin on this question. The Soviets at this point appear to have no intention, or at least no perception of a need to force communist regimes on their neighbors. Stalin believes that socialism was a powerful and popular post-war organic force in Eastern countries, and that socialist states friendly to the Soviet Union would emerge on their own accord democratically. This may have been naive, it may have been misguided, but it challenges the orthodox chronology of the Cold War. But it is what Stalin believed. And in the months between Yalta and the fall of Berlin, friction between US, Britain, and the Soviet Union begin to increase over Soviet policies in the Eastern European countries that they're occupying. The first signs of trouble begin over the Soviet policy in post-war Romania. Romania was a monarchy under King Michael, but under a military dictatorship with General Ion Antonescu as its premier, in a way that Imperial Japan under the emperor was governed by General Hideki Tojo in reality. Ion Antonescu was I would describe him not even as a fascist, but as an outright Nazi, a member of the Legion of the Archangel Michael, known as the Iron Guard, an ultra-nationalistic, anti-Semitic, anti-Magyar, anti-Hungarian, anti-Ziganistic, in other words, against gypsies, opposed to both communism and capitalism. It fit exactly the definition of National Socialism, Nazism, except for its ultra-sectarian Eastern European or Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Unlike the German Nazis, who favored traditional paganism over Judeo-Christianity, the Iron Guard, as I say, were ultra-Eastern Orthodox Christians. The Iron Guard had been founded by Corneliu Codernu, a Romanian Hitler wannabe, but he was killed before he could take power. The symbol of the Legion of Archangel Michael, or the Iron Guard, was this iron grill-like device on a green flag, that green background. Here you can see just on the roof of this meeting of the Iron Guard, these little Nazi pennants and then the Iron Guard grill over almost in the center, a German state cross. Codreanu will die in 1938, but the movement will live on. And he becomes a kind of martyr inside of Romania. There's even a Romanian volunteer division of the Waffen SS, like in all the countries. I may be wrong in saying that he died in 38. Perhaps he died in 1940, because I see on one of the stamps 1940. Here again, you can see an Iron Guard medal that was part of the Romanian military during their reign, during Antonescu's reign. Antonescu himself was a member of the Iron Guard, and he eventually absorbed the Iron Guard into the Romanian state. Here you can see sometimes that pro-Trump, pro-white power meetings in the United States, you still see the Iron Guard flag among Romanian right-wing adherents. Unless you know what you're looking at, often it's very hard to understand exactly what many of these symbols mean. This one certainly refers to the Romanian Iron Guard. In 1941, the Romanians, as Nazi allies, will attack Russia in June 1941 and conduct themselves sometimes worse than the Germans in the Black Sea regions of occupied Soviet Ukraine. In total, some 380,000 to 400,000 Jews under Romanian jurisdiction were murdered by the Iron Guard in both the Soviet Union and in Romania, with perhaps another 50,000 Roma gypsy people also put to death by the Romanians in some of the most worst atrocities of the war, including the infamous Romanian death trains. People by the thousand were just put into these trains and kept them in the heat without water or food until they died and were just taken away by Iron Guard functionaries. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army had pushed the Romanians out of Russia and was now pushing into Romania. A cabal of Romanian politicians, army generals, Iron Guardists, along with pro-Allied factions and armed Communist Party partisans, all endorsed by King Michael, overthrew Antonescu and surrendered to the Allies, at least to the Soviet Union, in August of 1944. The Romanians swiftly signed an armistice with the promise of ceasing all hostility towards the Soviet Union. Stalin did not dismantle the monarchy. He did not prosecute the Iron Guard, nor did Stalin put Romania under heavy-handed occupation. Stalin allowed King Michael and the same cabal of Romanian politicians, Iron Guardsmen, and Romanian army officers that he acted in concert with to overthrow Antonescu to appoint a new premier who would form a post-war government. As premier, they chose General C. Sănătescu, a former chief of the royal court and a prominent Iron Guardist. It was not a very diplomatic choice. General Sănătescu had been in command of Romanian forces in the invasion of Russia at both the Battle of Odessa and at Stalingrad. In Odessa, Romanian troops under his command ran wild with the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi mobile killing units, in the killing of Jews. So his curriculum vitae hardly smacked of Romanian friendship with the Soviet Union, let alone neutrality. And as Sănătescu began to attempt to form his government in September of 1944, he now proceeded to heavy-handedly attempt to form a right-wing Iron Guardist, revivalist, conservative coalition government that completely excluded the Romanian National Democratic Front, the coalition of Romanian liberal left and communist parties. It was blatantly clumsy, and it tended to openly reassert Iron Guard supremacy in Romania. After two confidence crises, Sănătescu was replaced as premier in December of 1944 by the king with General Nicolae Radescu, another Iron Guard general. However, even with his Iron Guard background, General Radescu was a more palatable choice. During the war, Radescu had been publicly critical of both the Nazis and Antonescu and had been arrested and detained as an opponent for the duration of the war. Although Radescu now as premier yielded some seats in the cabinet to the National Democratic Front, Romanian national policy under his government remained essentially right-wing conservative and rooted in the Iron Guard ideology and establishment. The same communist factions that ushered out Antonescu in the previous August, now in the winter of 1945, began engaging in strikes and street fighting with Iron Guard pro-government parties. In February 1945, as Yalta was taking place, General Radescu now gave a public speech during which he openly stated his anti-Soviet and anti-communist convictions, saying that communists were, quote, godless foreigners with no homeland, end of quote. A thinly veiled way of saying they were a, quote, cosmopolitan Judeo-Bolshevik, end of quote, force in the language of National Socialist exterminationist ideologues. Stalin, upon hearing this, was outraged. Following the speech, Stalin sent the dreaded Soviet Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Vyshinsky, to Romania to meet with the king and his advisors and read them the Riot Act. Vyshinsky was, of course, the notorious and feared former state prosecutor during the 1930s, who oversaw Stalin's purge show trials that resulted in millions of executions in the USSR. Since then, he had been promoted to the Foreign Affairs Ministry and as Molotov's deputy. Vyshinsky demanded the immediate dismissal of General Radescu and his replacement with a leftist Romanian politician, Petru Groja, the head of the Plowmen's Front, a left-wing agrarian peasants' party founded in the 1920s, which so far had been kept locked out of the government and which now led the National Democratic Front coalition, of which the communists were one of several left-wing parties. Vyshinsky, in the diplomatic notes released in the 1990s, stated that Romania's government attempt to lock out communists from the government and its hostility to the Soviet Union were violations of the armistice signed in 1944. He told the Romanians that the Soviet Union was acting to stabilize the political situation in Romania, that it was protecting Russian security by ensuring that no unfriendly government comes back into power in Romania, and that it was acting with restraint and moderation, and hopefully would not need to resort to the redeployment of Soviet forces into Romania to put things in order. The king and his advisors got the message. In March 1945, Petru Groja was now appointed as the new premier, and left-wing communist coalition began its march to eventually govern Romania at this point. To Stalin's surprise and shock, Winston Churchill denounced what had just happened and accused the Soviet Union of interfering in the internal affairs of Romania in a breach of the Yalta Declaration on Liberated Europe. Stalin could not understand Churchill's objections at all. Compared to the British military suppression of the communists in Greece at the same time, Certainly what the Soviets did in Romania in February was indeed restrained and moderate, exactly as Wyszynski had characterized it. In Greece, the British were drowning the country in blood, killing off former anti-Nazi communist resistance cells to ensure the restoration of the old pre-war right-wing Greek regime that had been friendly to British interests in the Mediterranean. The civil war that the British propagate in Greece and will later be joined by US support will endure until 1949, and some 180,000 Greeks will die in it. Stalin stood back and sacrificed the Greek Communist Party as per the percentage agreement with Churchill, which Churchill had written in his own hand and which Stalin and Churchill had signed off on, and Stalin let the British have a free hand in Greece in what was their zone of interest according to the agreement. Stalin expected the exact same courtesy and respect from Churchill to Russia's interests in Romania as he had given the British in Greece. It was only fair. Churchill attempted to rally Roosevelt for a joint complaint to the Soviets on Romania. Roosevelt refused, responding curtly, quote, "Romania is not a good place for a test case," end of quote. It was, after all, Churchill who had proposed that percentage agreement without Roosevelt's present to Stalin in the first place. Roosevelt especially needed Russia in the Pacific in the war being waged against Japan. Roosevelt and Stalin shared the same policy goals in China vis-a-vis Japan's expansion, since the US and Soviet Union restored their foreign relations way back in 1933. But as the war entered its last month in April, with the Red Army now constricting its ring around Berlin for the final battle to defeat Nazi Germany, the biggest source of friction remained Poland. And again, it's going to be Winston Churchill who's going to pursue the issue. I've already described the two conflicting viewpoints upon the nature of the provisional Polish government. The Soviets were not going to scrap the government and form a new one, as Churchill was demanding. They would only expand the current one in Warsaw, adding other party members, including those outside of Poland, but only those factions that recognized the Curzon line as per the Yalta Protocols. On this, Stalin would not budge. And certainly the provision of the Yalta Agreement was vague enough for the Soviets to insist that they were living up to its terms. Again, the particular term reads, "The provisional government which is now functioning in Poland should therefore be reorganized on a broader democratic basis with the inclusion of democratic leaders from Poland itself and from the Poles abroad." The former London Pows were hardly, quote, democratic in their representation of the former military dictatorship of pre-war Poland. Stalin constantly reminded the US and Britain that in 1938, Poland had taken a piece of Czechoslovakia as an ally of Nazi Germany in the partition and destruction of Czechoslovakia. Churchill saw differently. In April, he described the Soviet plan as simply one to add, quote, "a few other Poles to the existing administration of Russian puppets," end of quote. Churchill appealed to Roosevelt, writing, quote, "This is a test case between us and the Russians on the measuring, which is to be, sorry, let me say that again. This is a test case between us and the Russians on the meaning which is to be attached to such terms as democracy, sovereignty, independence, representative government, and free and unfettered elections. Poland has lost her frontier. Is she now to lose her freedoms? End of quote. As in the case of Romania, Roosevelt did not want to openly challenge the Soviets, preferring to negotiate further the issue of Poland with them. In April, as this was happening, Roosevelt remarked to his cabinet that he was having, quote, considerable difficulty with British relations, end of quote. And he joked that the British, quote, were perfectly willing for the United States to have a war with Russia anytime, end of quote. Roosevelt was more concerned about the upcoming San Francisco conference, which was going to establish the United Nations and to ensure smooth Soviet participation in the United Nations and in the war in the Pacific against Japan. And so Roosevelt now cables Churchill a response in which he states that the British were putting an unproportional emphasis on criticizing the presence of the Lublin Pows in the provisional government over the presence of other groups. Roosevelt urged Churchill to back off and give everybody time to negotiate the final composition of the provisional Polish government. In the meantime, Roosevelt cables Stalin April 1st, stating his concern over the Soviet interpretation of the Yalta Protocols on Poland. Roosevelt tells Stalin that any Polish solution, quote, which would result in a thinly disguised continuance of the present Warsaw regime would be unacceptable and would cause the people of the United States to regard the Yalta Agreement as having failed. End of quote. On April 7th, Stalin will cable back with his final position. He will state that by attempting to force him to appoint London Pows, who represented the old Polish pre-war government, which had been dictatorial and hostile to the Soviet Union, and which did not currently recognize the Yalta provisions for the Curzon Line, was in violation of the Yalta Agreement. Stalin gave Roosevelt a face-saving escape hatch by blaming the British and American ambassadors in Moscow for insisting on the inclusion of the London Pows in error and refused to budge further on the question. It would be a deal breaker for Stalin. And so on April 10th, Roosevelt now cabled Churchill, indicating his disappointment with Stalin's response, but insisting that they will need, quote, to consider most carefully the implications of Stalin's attitude and what is to be our next step, end of quote. Roosevelt essentially made it clear the United States was not going to butt heads with Russia over Poland any more than it would over Romania. And then, 2 days later, on April 12th, 1945, everything will be changed forever. Roosevelt suddenly died without ever mentioning what he might have in mind for, quote, the next step, if anything. Historians still debate today the significance of Roosevelt's death to U.S.-Russian relations and the beginning of the Cold War. Some argue that Roosevelt was committed to post-war military and economic cooperation with the Soviet Union, and his reluctance to confront the Soviets on Romania and Poland was indicative of his recognition of the Soviet spheres of influence in Eastern Europe in the post-war future. Others argue that he was bidding for time to ensure a smooth founding of the United Nations, which depended upon Soviet cooperation and the participation, and on the need for Soviet military participation to finish the war against Nazi Germany and Japan. Others argue that Roosevelt was running out of patience with the Soviets and was ready to confront them on the issue of Poland, that would have been his next step. Whatever Roosevelt's next step was to be, it was up to the new president, Harry S. Truman, to interpret. And Harry S. Truman, unfortunately, was thrust into power. And really, it didn't matter to Truman. As the New York Times headline proclaims, Truman to continue policies. That was nowhere near the case. In fact, Truman was mostly unaware of Roosevelt's policy plans. Harry S. Truman was an outsider to Roosevelt's administration, selected as a vice president in FDR's fourth term elections in November of 1944 to appease right-wing Southern conservative Americans in the Democratic Party who thought Roosevelt's previous vice president, Henry Wallace, was too left and too pro-labor. And so Roosevelt dumped Henry Wallace and chose Truman as his kind of counterpoint to include conservative, right-wing, Southern forces in the United States. Roosevelt had rarely consulted with Truman or kept him in his confidence during the brief term of his fourth presidency. Truman had no stake in Roosevelt's previous reforms or his foreign and trade policy goals with the Soviet Union, although Truman had supported certainly Roosevelt. Harry Truman was going to have to make his own way into the ending of the Second World War, forever changing in his own way Russian-American relations in the way nobody had anticipated. And Truman would begin with confronting the Soviets over the unfolding issue of Poland. We'll see in the next lecture how U.S.-Russian relations were about to take an unexpected turn over Poland.